what we're going to focus on today is third-party risk management. And third-party risk management is sort of it's an unattractive term. It's typically associated with just being a pain in the butt, a time waster. It's you as a security professional or an engineer or an IT person in an organization, you get pulled into these third-party risk assessments. And it's just everything just sort of like falls in your lap, and it's this hurry up and wait sort of, imagined emergency. And I hope, if we're doing this talk live, I'd ask folks to raise their hand as to whether they've ever seen some ridiculous questionnaire like this. And, there's always this is usually how it sort of ends up manifesting, is through a series of spreadsheets or Word documents, or it's this very kind of mechanical back and forth. And the funny thing about this whole dynamic is this way of assessments being done this way has sort of spawned a number of, it's almost spawned this boutique cottage industry in and of itself, where there's companies popping up that focus on how to streamline the spreadsheet answering process, how to sort of outsource it and do it as a service, so to speak, which is unfortunate if the name of the game is really all about managing risk in an environment. So a lot of people have fallen into this. A lot of peers of mine and friends of mine have fallen into this, where you work so hard to as an organization to prepare for and meet these these requirements, these controls, this documentation, all of that, to get certified in some way, shape, or form. And SOC 2 is a popular one. SOC 2 Type 2 audits. ISO 27001 is another big one. It might be FedRAMP. There's a number of certifications out there. The point, though, is that very frequently, it's funny, the industry sort of creates all of these certifications to, in theory, solve this problem, but then not a lot of actual organizations rely on them or lean into reciprocity from them, and so they will send out a questionnaire above and beyond, or asking all the same damn questions as what you covered in SOC 2, or what asking to see your policies yet again, just so they have it on file. And so, according to some research that I was doing as I was putting these slides together, this firm Penores had, based on their research, companies taking an average of 9 weeks to complete a security questionnaire. And some of that's the size. I mean, I've seen questionnaires that go up to like 500 questions, which is just bananas. Some are very quick and easy, but it's oftentimes unexpected work that comes your way. And if you're not bucketing for it or allocating for it, that's one of the things that contributes to the delay or to the slowdown. And so in general, though, we have this massive sort of delay or time sink, if you will, in completing one of these questionnaires. And that's above and beyond, of course, the work that an organization did to get certified in whatever standards or frameworks that are out there that they're certified against. Again, SOC 2 Type 2, ISO 27000, PCI DSS, FedRAMP, the list goes on. So there's a requirement typically, and this exists also in the frameworks, that you do as an organization some kind of third-party risk management. That means, or how that's frequently interpreted, is anytime that you're bringing in a new tool, whether it's like a vendor services or a new IT tool, the next latest and greatest Slack, the new video conferencing platform, the new infrastructure as a service provider, whatever it is, you have some means by which you're assessing the security and managing the risk around that potential engagement. And so, which in theory sounds great. We like last year around the same time as a collective, we were going through the SolarWinds supply chain incident response, and on account of that, supply chain was the new hot term that existed all over the industry. Everyone wanted to talk about supply chain risk management, and supply chain and third-party risk management, I think it means a lot of different things to a lot of people. So, in some settings, supply chain means, checking the chips and the wires on laptops, on workstations, on servers as they're going into an environment. That's obviously very controlled, very expensive to do, and doesn't even make sense in the context of like a cloud native environment. And so in those circumstances, supply chain might mean something more to the effect of doing this kind of vendor or supplier maintaining an inventory and having some high level metadata about who those organizations are. Other thing to note is, in many organizations, and I certainly experienced this working at SaaS companies myself, is you are both managing your own third-party risk management program, as well as managing or partaking in other third-party risk management programs. So that is the risk management programs of the prospects or customers of the company that you're working for. And then lastly, and we'll get into this in the second half of this talk, is you can buy the most secure stuff in the world from the most secure organizations in the world, and you can still do horrible things with it and use it horribly incorrectly and have things just kind of blow up in your face. And so that is one area that I believe that third-party risk management sort of falls completely flat as a discipline. And I'll tell this story through the eyes of FedRAMP. Is in many federal agencies, there's this collective mindset, and I noticed this in the private sector as well around SOC 2 and stuff. But there's this collective mindset that if you are procuring some piece of software, some tool, some let's say Slack, or let's say Box, whatever, the immediate sort of mindset is, if it's gone through FedRAMP, then it's safe. End of story, period. We can move on and go solve other problems. If it hasn't gone through FedRAMP or hasn't achieved that level of accreditation, then it's not safe. And it's a very broad blanket statement that's not really helpful. And I think it shines a light on a error in the way that the sort of problem or the opportunity, if you will, is being framed. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later on, but I wanted to sort of add this or provide this overall context as to like what we're going to spend our time on talking through today. So the typical process for how these things end up coming to pass is your organization is out. It's building product, it's building stuff, it's doing services. And, the sales team is out trying to drum up new leads. And lo and behold, they find themselves, in some new organizations. They're in the sales cycle with some new prospect. And the purchasing organization, they have their own third-party risk management program, of course, don't we all? So they want to make sure that whatever this thing is that somebody there wants to buy is secure. They send over all the questionnaires that they have. They send over requests for all the policies you have. Maybe they ask to do interviews. It's not very common that you do like in person or even like live audits or anything like that. So you're doing a lot of this, like you get all these asynchronous asks. Now, you're expected to of course, because there's a sale on the line, because there's a big deal on the line, you're expected to turn this thing around like a week ago and sort of have been omnipresent with with the ask and with the information. That of course is impossible, and so everything is sort of hung up on the deal until you, as a security person, get this thing done and get it back over to the customer. At least that's been my experience, and that has been consistent across 3 different startups with a lot of different customers, small and large. Now, that process, that back and forth, in my opinion, has some fairly consistent and inherent flaws in it. So the first of those is the fact that there is a total misaligned incentive. And this sort of little graphic here, it's focused on feature development, but I think it very nicely applies to this third-party risk management scenario as well, in the sense that if you're running out of time as a salesperson. Salespeople and sales teams oftentimes work on quarters, and they have quotas attached to them. That's how they're performance. That's how they're measured. So you're running out of time in your quarter, and you're trying to maximize your the amount of sales that you've closed within your assigned quota. If you go over that, you might hit an accelerator, get a bonus. Everything is good in the world. If you don't, then maybe you're on a PIP and you're potentially in a tough spot. You're in hot water, or maybe you're in that sweet spot and you're okay. But in general, the closer that you get to the end of the quarter, the more leverage that the other organization has. They can start demanding bigger price cuts. The salesperson is much more inclined to make deals when they're not sort of breathing down the end of a quarter, especially in the world of SaaS, where the cost and like price adjustment models are so there's so much in favor of the SaaS organization to sort of abstract away their cost, and there's a lot of wiggle room there. And so the other organization also has this leverage, like if they want to request certain features, let's say something's missing, then there might be an incentive to start putting commitments on the line, and the security commitments. This is how I got one of the startup jobs that I was in. Is somebody had a big enterprise customer on the line, and they committed to being SOC 2 Type 2 compliant by a certain date. And then once they committed to it, and it was in a contract, and there was money on the line, then they had the oh crap moment. What do we do now? Now we have to actually figure out a way to satisfy this thing, to make it work. And so they went out like scrambling to find a security person. I was the lucky individual that they ended up choosing, and on account of that, we ended up just basically working backwards from that date that was pre-agreed upon. And so this kind of pattern happens all the time, and it creates this pressure that of course you are going to be satisfactory to the requirements being put upon you, which goes against the actual spirit of honest, truthful, transparent answers that help an organization better manage its risk posture. And then separately, because it's very expensive to do audits on everything, that's where SOC 2 comes in, where you have an independent auditor. But again, most people don't actually just take that for what it is. Because it's very expensive to do individual audits on everything, there's oftentimes a dynamic where the answers are completely self-attested. So it's the organization sort of with their take-home test filling out all the answers. And there's really no way that you can verify what's coming out of those. There's some amount you can request artifacts to support what it is you're doing. Let's say, request a pen test report. Maybe you can request, you can set them up in something like a bit site or a security scorecard or something along those lines that is doing independent, passive, and sometimes active analysis of like an organization's external attack surface, or their things that are in the news, things like that. But beyond actually like getting in and starting to test things or relying on the output of other tests, there's really not a good way of validating of validating and verifying what comes back in these spreadsheets. And so, so if you ask for, some whiz bang thing as far as a control goes, and they say they do it, or they provide a lot of words that sort of skate around the answer, you've really got to be like reading between the lines, or your team does, to tease out all the nuance and question them one way or another. And of course, all this stuff just takes a tremendous amount of time. And I think one of the other challenges with this overall problem, and this is where the circling back to the FedRAMP thing I mentioned a little bit ago, is all of this effort, all of this time and energy and focus really only focuses on, let's say for rough purposes, 50% of the problem. So, or half the problem, if we're not comfortable assigning a number to it, is the thing that you're buying, whether the services or the tool, is it built in a secure and compliant way that I can then attest to as part of my own security program. It does nothing to address the other part of the equation. And and one other sort of side note on the whole note about wasting time is what happens to all of these answers. So I'm in a lot of CISO working groups and Slack workspaces with other security leaders and such, and it is very, very rare for you to see anybody say anything to the effect of, well, we actually did something with respect to an answer, or something changed with respect to an answer that a company gave. Oftentimes, because the leverage in that supplier to consumer dynamic or relationship that exists, the leverage is such that you really don't have a ton of, like, because you can't verify anything, you probably also can't change anything if you don't like an answer. Because one of the other dynamics that exists here is, security as an industry has been positioning itself and beating the drum of, security as an enabling factor, as an enabling force. And, that sounds great on the surface, but what that means is, like, how do we, or at least what that means to a lot of people, I don't want to make speak for everyone, but is like, how do we get to guess for some stakeholder and do it safely? And so oftentimes there's somebody else at the purchasing organization that wants this thing. And so they are the ones seeking a yes. So that other security team also has very likely some kind of pressure on it to say yes, or find a way to get to the safe, answer, which also kind of erodes the spirit of what third-party risk management is all about. So, again, circling back to this 50%, if we consider all of these dynamics of, the incentive structure and the self-attestation and the lack of verification, 50, let's say you're managing 50% of the risk, but are you really doing it 100% effectively? Maybe you're only doing it 60% effectively. And, and therefore you're not actually managing 50% of the risk. You're managing much less than that. Maybe it actually comes down to like 30%, something, something closer to that. And it's, that your sort of risk management story starts to fall apart as you pull on this thread. So this is really where we want to see us moving, is effectively doing the first part of the story. So making sure that what we're buying, what we're bringing into our organizations, that third, fourth party management, is compliant, and it's secure. But then separately, how do we connect that to implementation and operationalizing things? Will you use it securely? Will you integrate it securely? And how will you know and have confidence in those things having happened the way that you expect? Will it be aligned with the policies that you've set up, et cetera, et cetera? So that really is the second half of the story around risk management, in my humble opinion. So, duplicate slide. There you go. So I'm going to talk about this through the lens of this. So this graphic, for anyone who has not seen it, is a thing called the cyber defense matrix, and I'm going to talk about this process, or this managing the second half of the risk through the lens of the cyber defense matrix. And the general idea here is these things along the top are different classes of activities or different classes of security control according to the NIST CSF framework. So identify, how do you identify these various things? How do you protect them, detect whether something has gone wrong inside of them? And once you detect, how do you respond to it? And then how do you recover back to normal operations? And then the things along the left here are different asset classes. And so, you can sort of use this framework to sort of frame up a lot of different conversations. In this particular context, it's most relevant to think about applications in the perspective of like SaaS, PaaS, cloud service providers that would fall into that third party bucket, third or fourth party bucket. If you're talking about procuring or engaging with like a services organization, that might be users, for example. So just to sort of like tee up your frame of mind going into the rest of this talk. So from my perspective, one second, give myself a drink here. So from my perspective, there are common canonical risks that exist across most cloud service providers that you might choose to sign up for or purchase and start using. Whether it's a logging tool, whether it's something to manage identity, whether it's a document collaboration, whether it's email. A lot of these problems are fairly consistent, if not universally consistent, across all of them, at least in my experience. So the first is you lose data, or you put the wrong kind of data that you weren't expecting into it. So an example here might be you're using GitHub or GitLab or some kind of source code management solution, and you're expecting that only code goes into it. But in reality, let's say somebody accidentally maps includes a big spreadsheet with PII or credit card numbers or something in a local repository that's synced to a Git repo, and they check all that stuff into the repository. So, is that a problem for your particular organization? How would you know? Credential compromise would be like a user, let's say my Google account in this case, or my Box account being compromised. Of course, that could happen through like insecure password reusage or credential stuffing, or just phishing, things like that. The provider getting breached, always an issue. Any organization is subject to potential breach or potential compromise. Nobody is necessarily immune from this regardless of your sort of operating posture. In over permissioned integration. So most tools, especially in this cloud service provider space, are not designed to run as a total stovepipe, meaning that they don't connect to anything else. They don't integrate with anything. Most things get their power and their value, or they get incremental or added value as they connect to more things. So let's say you use Salesforce and Slack, for example, and Box. Let's just throw those 3 CSPs out there. And you want to notify your sales team anytime that a new provider enters into the CRM that is Salesforce, You're storing any documents that they may have provided during like a marketing touch point or something into Box, and you add a link to it. A link to that Slack notification right to the Box folder, so they can go like get real-time context on what's happening. Sometimes and oftentimes, third-party risk management, that first half of the equation, it looks at solutions in a vacuum. That's frequently how these programs are designed, is looking at, you're procuring Google Workspace, you're procuring Salesforce, HubSpot, Slack, Intercom, whatever it is. They're not necessarily considering how that thing is going to be operationalized, what it's going to connect to. So, like, let's say, for example, you've done the work to do risk classification of every service. Let's say Slack is rated as a moderate risk application, and Salesforce is a high, or Box is a high, or whatever in your context. It almost doesn't even matter. But like, what happens when somebody integrates a high to a moderate, or a high to a low, or a moderate to a low, or vice versa? And there's potential data traversal, or file traversal, or access traversal, or something across those boundaries. Is that a problem in your environment, or is it not? And how do you know? And then the last thing is focused on how you're configuring the solution itself. So, assume it is a stovepipe, for example. How is that thing configured? Oftentimes there's at least some amount of configuration settings in these tools, whether it's password policies or single sign-on settings, or whatever it is. Sometimes there's a huge amount of configuration options. Take something like Salesforce. Like, you could go down the rabbit hole in a lot of ways, trying to figure out all the ways that you could configure or misconfigure something like Salesforce or ServiceNow. These very complex things that are more in the platform as a service space. So, there's different buckets of risk that are common across these various platforms, or these various solutions. And that list, 5 things on the last slide, that is certainly not complete. There's a lot more things that could go wrong. There's a lot more things that are probably universally applicable. Sorry about that. So I think in many ways, the ultimate risk associated with a third-party provider is dependent on and influenced by the way that you intend to use something and the way that you actually use something. And so a couple of questions to ask yourself as you're thinking about use and risk are things like, who's going to end up using the tool within our organization, or maybe outside of our organization? Who's going to administer it? Will it be a centralized team? Is it the security team? Is it the team that's buying it? Will you have single points of failure? What data do you plan on putting into it? How mission critical is it going to be? So something like a single sign-on solution, I'd say is like it is certainly along the lines of mission critical, because it's a gate for most everything else to manage authentication. And that's like, if something goes wrong there, then it has this cascading failure on all these other business functions. And so, like, if you're going to be very reliant on it, then you're going to want to do something to more effectively manage that particular angle of the risk. Will you integrate that service with other things? If so, what? If so, why? And how are you going to do that safely? Should anyone be able to do the integration? Or, like, for example, in the context of something like Slack, you can frequently just if it's not restricted, that is, any user can just add a new integration. Any user can pull down a new app from the sort of Slack like marketplace app store thing and just start running it, or build their own app. If you're in more of an engineering culture, building bots. And maybe that's overly risky in the environment you're working in, or maybe it's perfectly viable. but it's something that I think is a conversation worth having. And so there's also a lot of different vendor categories that are popping up along the lines of third-party risk management. So, this is a little bit of alphabet soup here. So you've got like SaaS, security posture management, you've got data loss prevention, cloud access security broker, and identity and access management solutions, and the list really goes on. Like, you can kind of browse through like the Foresters and the Gartners to get a sense of like the full extent of what this looks like, or just put your email address in like RSA and let the emails sort of bombard you. But thinking about where some of these things fall, so in a lot of cases you will get these emails from SaaS providers, and there's a lot of silver bullet thinking. It's kind of like engaging in a ShamWow commercial, and in the security scene sometimes. And talk about something like SSPM, which is all about, is what you're connecting it to secure? Is it configured correctly? One of those questions from the previous slide. And is it configured correctly? Meaning the application, is it configured correctly? Basically just falls here and only here. It doesn't identify other SaaS apps that might need protecting. It doesn't identify the devices that are connecting to it, the networks that you might allow access from, the data that goes into it, the users that are controlling access to it. It really only influences stuff right here. And that's interesting when you start to sort of chart this out. Because if you're thinking about, let's say you have, a $2 million budget or something, or $1 million budget, and you need to figure out like, how am I going to sort of like optimize for managing as much risk as I can for the money that I have. And if you spend way too much money right here, maybe that's not what you actually want to do. Something like a CASB solution sort of sits alongside of this, might bleed a little bit into the detect or into the protection mode, sort of like cascades out a little bit here. But I think it's like one of the most powerful things, at least in my experience dealing with CASBs, is, they run some kind of like proxy, some kind of agent, what have you, and they help you in identifying just the things that are happening, the devices that are connecting to SaaS apps, what apps they're connecting to, where those things are, and maybe what kind of data is going into what applications. And that's really helpful. But it also doesn't solve all of your problems. It's not, you're not buying one thing and having it cover all 25 squares on this grid. An identity management solution, again, is going to be focused mostly on users. Maybe if you configure it properly, you can get it to accommodate or be aware of the devices that a user might be using. This is, maybe where you start having a zero trust oriented conversation of, you're only allowing trusted, managed, certificate enabled devices to log into certain services. And then they also have to go through your whatever strong authentication protocol you've got set up. And, we could keep going down this rabbit hole of like data loss prevention. It's a data oriented thing. And so, you're kind of covering one swim lane here, primarily. Now, again, like these mappings are not scientific. This is more to start and manage and facilitate the conversation around what it is you're buying and how it fits into this broader security program that you might be either working within or running yourself. So with that,